According to the President Tinubu, the country is gradually leaving the fiscal imbalances, such as huge debt-to-GDP ratio, huge backlog of forex forwards owed to businesses, and more. Many analysts and groups have since cast their doubt on the president's claim.
Now, despite reports of the Central Bank of Nigeria breaking its own laws, allegedly lending above 5% limit, the institution says it is maintaining its ways and means advances to the federal government at 5% still. This follows a bill passed by the National Assembly, which raised the maximum borrowing percentage in the Act from 5% to 10%. Joining us is economic and investment analyst Tilewa Adebajo. Good morning, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Great to have you. I think, first of all, we need to get some clarity on the president's claims that the 30 trillion ways and means has been repaid. Many say that the president exaggerated the 30 trillion ways and means repayment. Let's first of all get your thoughts on that. Has that loan been paid back? Or did Mr. President use some technical maneuvers to make that claim?
Thank you very much, and good morning. As far as the ways and means is concerned, I think what we should understand is that the ways and means is still on the books of the Central Bank of Nigeria as of today. There's still about 32 to 33 trillion, according to what we have seen. What happened with the ways and means was that the ways and means were securitized, and they were sent to the National Assembly to approve that securitization. But unfortunately, that is illegal. The National Assembly does not have the power to approve the securitization of ways and means for repayment to the Central Bank of Nigeria. Section 38 of the CBN Act is very clear that the Central Bank of Nigeria cannot accept securitization as a way of repayment of ways and means facility. So that is what the CBN Act says. Now, even though you might have increased the limit, the fact is that you cannot borrow any more money for ways and means until you have paid the existing outstanding ways and means. The previous government, under President Buhari, accumulated about 23.7 trillion in ways and means, and this current government added another 7 trillion to it in 5 months last year, making it a total of over 30 trillion. So what needs to happen in Nigeria today is that the central bank needs to clarify the position. The Ministry of Finance, through the Debt Management Office, also needs to clarify the position. And what we need to do is we need to create remedial legislation to be able to resolve these ways and means problems. Either we set up a resolution trust vehicle, such as an AMCON for the federal government, that will allow the Central Bank of Nigeria to be able to accept a form of repayment that is within the terms of the law. To add to that, I think the Central Bank of Nigeria is yet to publish its accounts for 2023. The 2022 account, which was done by the previous governor of the central bank, shows 23.7 trillion in ways and means with a footnote as credits to government. So that has already been reflected in its books. But of course, again, it hasn't told us how it got approval to extend its limits for ways and means, which is below 1 trillion to actually about 32 trillion as we are today. So that is really where we are today with ways and means.
All right. Still talking about, you made reference to Section 38 of the CBN Act 2007. And one thing that the Act does provide for is that the CBN, ways and means should be a last resort, not a primary financier of the government's debt. In the ways that the government has carried, this administration and the last administration, would you say that they have sought, use this as a means of last resort and not a primary financier? And what would you say are the implications of the fact that maybe we keep hearing conversations about ways and means over and over again? What will be the implication on the economy?
Well, as you have rightly said, Section 38 of the CBN Act looks at ways and means as a very, very punitive form of financing. It is not the sort of financing that you're supposed to go to. It's not your go-to source of financing. It's a financing of last resort. First of all, the criteria is such that the money you can borrow must be based on your previous year's revenue. So it's a percentage of that previous year's revenue. So even with the increase with the National Assembly, the ways and means should not be more than 1.5 to at least 1.5 trillion. That is what the law allows. But it's currently at 30 trillion. So you can see that that is indeed a gross violation of the ways and means financing. So what we need to do, as you have said, is the fact that there are reasons why this ways and means was put in place. When Obasanjo got debt relief for Nigeria way back then, one of the criteria that a lot of the institutions asked was that we set up an independent debt management office. The debt management office was set up, which was funded by DFID. Then we also had to set up the Fiscal Responsibility Act. A Fiscal Responsibility Commission was also set up, and this Section 38 was included in the CBN Act. And all these things were like financial circuit breakers to be able to help government to be able to be within the lines and the tenets of fiscal responsibility. So that was the reason why after the Obasanjo debt restructuring and debt forgiveness that we had to put in financial circuit breakers, legal and regulatory framework to prevent government from getting itself into this situation. So that's why all these laws were put in place. So government really is not supposed to resort to ways and means. It's supposed to be a funding of probably last resort. And the reality of ways and means is that the money you borrow, you're supposed to pay it back that same year. Otherwise, you will no longer have access to it. So that is why it's important that we need to sit down. We need to look at remedial legislation to be able to resolve these ways and means problem, because the Central Bank of Nigeria is going to be challenged to be able to reflect ways and means financing on its balance sheet and on its accounts without violating Section 38 of its own act. So that is really where the central bank has its challenge.
Yeah.
So that's why we're saying we need remedial legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was in the news a few months ago where Layemi Cardoso said that the government had paid back 7.3 trillion naira ways and means. So some people are assuming that that's what the president was referring to. The securitization of the 22.3, I believe, trillion naira, it's a different conversation entirely. And that's why initially I said, he's maybe using technical terms or maneuvers rather to claim that those funds have been paid back. It's also, maybe a little heartbreaking for economists and for Nigerians to see how the gains that Nigeria achieved in the Obasanjo administration and these circuit breakers that were put in place have now somehow just been thrown away. And we found ourselves where we are today in trillions and trillions of naira in debt. Talk a little bit more, provide some clarity as to the 5%, 10% argument, and also what exactly in core terms is securitization?
Thank you very much. The 5% was the original limit which the law was put into place. That is the limit of borrowing. So in order for you to go for ways and means financing, you can borrow maybe 5% of your previous year's revenue.
Yes.
So if you had revenues of 10 trillion the previous year before, you can only borrow 5% of that. So the legislators were now trying to increase it that you should be able to borrow 10% of the previous year's revenue. So they were trying to double the ways and means limits. But that's not the issue. The issue is the fact that you can't even increase even if you look at the limit of where Ways and Means is right now at 30 trillion. Our last year's revenue was about 17 trillion, projected revenue last year. So if you take a look at 30 trillion and you look at 17 trillion, you are finding out that the government is borrowing over 60%. The Ways and Means position right now is about 60% of previous year's revenue. So it's way above the 5% or the 6% limits. It's you can see how that is. But the next question you have also asked. Can you please remind me of your second question?
I'm trying to get our viewers to understand exactly what securitization means. I know you started by talking about how it was illegal, but what does it really mean?
Yes, securitization is legal. It's when you convert a loan into what you normally do is the government has an active program, which is the government bonds, which we see, such as treasury bills, are all securities that government sells on the capital markets. So that is really what you call securities, which is like the bond, the bonds, the government bonds and the government treasury bills are securities which the government raises on the capital markets. So that is the instruments, the investment instruments that the government sells to the capital markets. They're termed as securities. The money that government borrows from the central bank, as you know, directly is a loan. So if you take a look at what securitization is, that means that if you have a loan and you feel that you cannot, you want to get more money, then you go to the capital markets, then you convert your loan into a security such as a bond, and then you sell it to the public, and investors such as pension funds and other institutional investors and even private people, including banks, also will buy into those securities. Those are government securities, and we have a program which is managed by the Debt Management Office. So the Debt Management Office is in charge of issuing government securities. Now, that is very different from when the central bank when the federal government goes to the central bank and requires a direct loan. And that is really what we're talking about with Ways and Means. So government has multiple ways of financing itself, either through going to the capital markets to issue government securities, which is very distinct from when it goes to the central bank to borrow money directly, or it goes to the World Bank to borrow money directly. And government also has access to the international financial markets where it goes to raise Eurobonds, which is another form of international security, which is dominated in US dollars. So that's the big difference between a direct loan and a security. Securities are the ones that come into the capital markets for the general investment public.
All right. There was a photo that was put up earlier by our production team, the graphics by the CFG advisory, to show how we fared in the past, from 2010 to 2024. And if you look at that, from 2010 up until 2019, it was less than 10 trillion. And between 2020 and 2024, it's gone over 30 trillion. So we've seen some measure of maybe lack of financial prudence or fiscal prudence in the past 4 years. My concern is what the projection will be, maybe say for the next 2 to 4 years, and what this says to investors. What message are we conveying to our investors?
Thank you very much. Well, what I think is clear is that I think the central bank governor and also the Minister of Finance have said very clearly that they have stopped Ways and Means financing. We just need to confirm how much has been paid back. I think the announcement I saw last time, I've heard about 3 trillion has been paid back. As you can see, the graph has dropped between 2023 and 2024. We've seen a slight reduction in Ways and Means. That's the repayment that has been done, about between 3 to 4 trillion. The impact of Ways and Means is such that it causes inflation. One of the problems that we have is the fact that there's a direct correlation between the increase in Ways and Means and the increase in inflation that we have today. And right now, this has also moved money supply to about 100 trillion which is a record high. So the only way I see this going back forward, especially with the sort of level of exposure and the level of interest that we now have in Nigeria in ways and means, is such that this is something that has been stopped. And I think that the only way that this can happen is that we need to go down to take it back to its limits. Ways and means financing right now from the CBN Act should not be more than 2 trillion naira.
Okay, well, I mean, the next couple of months, maybe the next year, we'll see what new decisions that they take. Nigeria currently, I believe, they argue has a financing problem. And how do you think our financing issues will be sorted out? As we, of course, struggle with the NNPC, struggle with oil production and all that. How do you think that those problems could be sorted out?
It's very easy. It's not a big deal. What we need to do, first of all, is that we have lost our oil production. So we need to make the right investments. I've spoken to a lot of experts in the oil and gas industry, and a lot of them can find various assets that are currently idle, that if they make the right investments into those assets, we can increase our production by 900,000 barrels within the next 12 to 18 months. But we need to make the investments. Second of all, I think, as I've argued, the federal government needs to sell down its JV assets. NNPC has a lot of JV assets that it's partnering between 60%, and some of these it owns 100%. So NNPC needs to sell down its JV assets. And in the process of selling down its JV assets, I believe the government can raise $50 billion. By raising $50 billion, it puts you in a fantastic position, not only to resolve the issues of your debt, to help repay some of the debt, but also it gives you room to be able to engage in some fiscal projects. Because if you take a look at the fiscal side of things right now, the debt service budget is 8 trillion naira. The education budget is 2 trillion naira. And the defense budget is also about 2 trillion naira. So what you are telling us is that debt service is 4 times both the education and the defense budget. So this is not a sustainable position. So I think there are options available to the federal government, which is investing in the oil and gas sector, providing the necessary incentives for people to ramp up production back to about 2 million barrels a day. If we're producing 2 million barrels a day with oil at $70 a barrel, we won't have this position. We now have the Dangote refinery in operation, and the Dangote refinery will also reduce the demand for foreign exchange. Cost of oil importation and subsidy was close to $10 billion a year. So it will reduce the pressure on FX demand, which is a good sign for us. And of course, like I've said, you sell down your JV assets, you get another $50 billion. So then you restructure and put the economy towards the path of recovery. Because right now, the reform program is in a form of quagmire. And, the mistakes of the past where the government put the cart before the horse, we need to begin to correct that. And the biggest challenge our economy faces today is that of inflation. Ways and means and money supply at 100 trillion is causing significant inflation.
All right.
With inflation at 33%, you are reducing people's purchasing power. And we have 133 million Nigerians in multidimensional poverty.
I mean, it's not a good look. It's not a good look. We're talking about the numbers, but the everyday average Nigerian is feeling the heat and the impact of what, these decisions have caused on our economy. But, I mean, these are ongoing conversations. Thank you so much, Tilewa Adebajo, for joining us this morning on The Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.